There you go.
This doesn't have a clip. I'm going to have to hold it. All right. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for accommodating our last-minute schedule changes as well. And thank you very much to Miguel and Sophus for getting this together. My original goal with this event was really to keep going the kind of momentum that we gained last spring with the first big crypto party, and also to continue talking about these issues. Because if we don't continue talking about them, then they just fade into the background and become the thing you sort of remember occasionally about. And I think it's important. And so my goal in this talk today is to bridge a little bit between the issues that Andrew was talking about, having to do with the fairly overwhelming idea of being spied on by the government and being visible and having to think about policy issues and what does all of this mean for democracy, and the technical solutions of cryptography and encryption that we're going to talk about, that Claudia Orlandi will talk about next. But one of the things that Andrew was talking about today is privacy. One of the reasons why a lot of people were quite concerned about Snowden revelations, and the word that was probably used the most commonly in those discussions is the word privacy. And I would say, okay, but what's privacy? And what's privacy got to do with it anyway? So, in the fact that I'm an academic and I like to ask questions, I'm going to ask 4 questions in this talk. One of them is, what's privacy? And what does privacy have to do with data and surveillance and being visible? What are the assumptions on which a lot of our current interactions around data and our current use of the services, such as Microsoft Outlook, are built? And also, who is responsible? Who's responsible for data? Who's responsible for fixing this strange situation in which we find ourselves? But first, let's start with what's privacy. Because frankly, what is privacy? Anyone? Really? Because I think privacy is an abstract concept. In the everyday, how's your privacy doing today? Is your privacy doing okay? You wake up this morning, felt your privacy doing fine? In the everyday, privacy doesn't really mean a whole lot. We may have private information, private situations, private moments. But what's privacy? I mean, if you make it really simple, privacy is not public. And this is from Geek and Poke. It's one of my favorite online cartoon artists, and this is fantastic. Like a long time ago, some folks were worried about the privacy in the web. What's the web? Well, I heard it was a predecessor of Facebook. What's privacy? Really? What is it? Okay, so if you go to the dictionary will helpfully tell you that privacy is a state in which one is not observed or disturbed by other people. Okay, and also that the state of being free from public attention. The example for that one's actually quite interesting: a law to restrict newspapers' freedom to invade people's privacy. Here's the interesting thing. This I took from the Webster's English Dictionary. This one is interesting because that refers to this. In 1890, Warren and Brandeis wrote a legal paper and a legal ruling that is now known as the right to be left alone, and is probably one of the most influential bits of writing on the topic of privacy in existence. In the US, the right to be left alone is the notion, the legal notion of privacy. There is no legal notion of privacy per se, it's the right to be left alone. And it was originally developed because Warren and Brandeis felt that the journalists were getting into people's business, and that was untenable. This was 1890, you see. The yellow papers were just coming out, and it was big business. And so the ruling essentially said this is a principle which may be invoked to protect the privacy of the individual from invasion either by the too enterprising press, the photographer, or the possessor of any other modern device for recording or reproducing scenes or sounds. In fact, the photo camera was the culprit. Technological innovation led to this ruling. Now, this, in essence, things haven't changed. But this is the American view of things, and we're in Europe. So what's going on in Europe? Now, the European rulings are slightly different. In Europe, privacy is considered a right. And it's a different thing. It's a right to private life, to private and family life, not the right to be left alone. There's a very specific difference in these two formulations. Right? Here, the Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights essentially says everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home and his correspondence. This is about respect for it. It's a very different formulation. And it subjects certain restrictions. Certainly, this should be done in accordance with law, and it also allows circumvention for the prevention of disorder or crime, protection of health and morals, etc. The interesting thing about this particular ruling is that it's probably one of the most open-ended provisions in European law, and it has what's called a positive obligations. Now, most human rights statutes like this are composed of what's called negative obligations, or things the state cannot do, must not do. Here, the state ought to do something to ensure this right. The state ought to protect this right. This is important. This means the state has to do something. Now, the European General Data Protection Regulation that was just passed last December and will come into force in, I believe, middle of 2018, is what is basically the fulfillment of this requirement, of the requirement obligation to act, and an interpretation of what it means to have respect for one's private and family life. But none of this actually tells you what's privacy. Is privacy respect for your private and family life? Is it control over your data? Is it the right to be left alone? So if you go to more specific definitions of what is privacy, there's a number of scholars that have been trying to define this, and there is no actual one single definition of privacy, and everybody has their own. There are mathematical definitions of privacy. There are different notions of privacy. These three I selected as probably the most influential and most well-known in both policy circles and social science and humanities, and more generally in the conversation on privacy right now. The first is privacy as an individual's right to control, edit, manage, and delete information about themselves. This is a notion of privacy as control. It was first put forward by Alan Weston in the 60s. You wouldn't think in the 60s you had to control information about yourself, but you did. And the concept here is that if it's information about you, you ought to be able to decide whether you would like to disclose it or not. This is the notion of privacy as control. And Weston also came up with a taxonomy because he did a lot of research, and if you've ever heard of the notion of privacy fundamentalist and privacy unconcerned or privacy pragmatist, those are Weston's categories of the different types of people as internal characteristics. Some people are just more sharing than others. Some people care more than others. Now, the very important thing about this particular definition and Weston's work is that Weston was entirely not concerned with interpersonal relations. He was concerned with the relationship between the individual and the institution, specifically between the individual and the corporation. And thus, to him, this referred entirely to what you might think about and how you might feel about organizations or companies using data about you, collecting data about you. And thus the notion of control then is important. You would want to control these data, presumably. The next one is my personal favorite, is put forward by Irvin Altman, the idea that privacy regulation theory. That privacy isn't anything very specific, but it is the process, a process of controlling access to the self. It's selective control. Because sometimes I choose to share something, and sometimes I choose not to. And these decisions are entirely situational. This is about controlling boundaries. And I may make those decisions, given the kind of social context and the needs that I might have. It's much harder to encode legally and technically this sort of definition from the first one. Where the first one very clearly says who has control over what happens to data. This one does not. This one says it's controlling access to the self. What the hell does that mean? The third one, privacy as contextual integrity, is actually perhaps the most successful currently in terms of affecting policy. It was put forward by Helen Nissenbaum over a decade ago. Well over a decade ago, and it's a measure of how closely the flows of information conform to our expectations of what is to be done about them. So presumably there are norms of where information goes and who gets to see it. So for example, what you discuss with your doctor is a very particular set of information. You have expectations of who else will find out about this information, how this information will be shared, and how it will be cared for. These norms of flow and distribution, who gets to know and where it goes, are often violated if we're talking about our digital data. So for example, you are using Microsoft Outlook, and then you find out that the NSA has all that data. Now, clearly, you weren't expecting that. Clearly, that's a violation of your expectations. If you're a European citizen, clearly it is also a significant violation of both laws and norms. Why the hell would NSA have anything to do with my data? Privacy as contextual integrity has been, to some extent, worked into the notion of privacy by design. And if you've heard of privacy by design, there are very clear parallels between the two approaches. Privacy by design being that you need to design in these norms into how data are managed by our technical devices, by our technologies, by our services. The trick is it's very difficult to figure out what these norms are and how to design for them. And norms change. But thinking about norms is a pretty good step. So let me give you like a basic summary, really quickly, about what's privacy here. Privacy can be thought of as a social and cultural construct that's defined contextually. But it can also be thought of as a practical process of managing access to the self. Privacy violations are most often about violations of expectations. And they're driven by social norms. And the two norms to think about are these appropriateness and distribution. What's appropriate to share? And with whom is it appropriate to share it? Those are important. And finally, there are different kinds of privacy. Because if you think about it, information privacy, the sort of interpersonal information control and relationship management kind of thing, is different from exchanging information with institutions. Once again, different from managing your reputation. There are different kinds of data involved and different reasons for how and why you might not want to share data. But here's another way of thinking about it. It's perhaps a little bit more poetic, but it gets at why privacy is so difficult. Because really, instead of following this predetermined and internally coherent set of rules, we attempt to regulate our privacy given the social, cultural, economic, and legal constraints at hand. That is what we do. It's a tricky balance. It's hard. We screw up all the time. Privacy is not so much what is known or not known, but a condition of relative accessibility. It's how easy it is to access. It's not what's known or not known. The totality of the task of managing privacy is to achieve a balance between the need and desire for both privacy and publicity. We want both. We don't want to be completely unknown. We don't want to be completely public either. It's a matter of managing both. And for a certain degree of concealment and disclosure, for denying and granting access to others. When we're talking about data, and we're talking about personal management of these data, we're talking about us navigating constant tensions of wanting both, being visible and being invisible, being accessible and being inaccessible. How the hell do you design, and how the hell do you conceptualize technologies that can acknowledge and accommodate that? But what does any of this have to do with data? Well, as Andrew has already noted, when we find out, when our expectations are violated, and we find out that things are known about us in ways that we don't expect, things will get uncomfortable. We live in a world of data circulation. And these data can come to circulate in ways that are perhaps disturbing, that are perhaps uncomfortable. Now, most of the conversation today is going to be about our relationship between data, our relationship between us and institutions, and how we manage data for that. Because when we're talking about privacy in the context of talking about institutions, we're talking about surveillance more than privacy, really. We're talking about the fact that we don't like being watched, and it's hard to conceptualize being seen all the time. How do you conceptualize that everything you do is seen? By whom? And so what? How do you manage it? And in the end, in the way that the technology has been designed so far, the question then suddenly becomes, is it about is it about really surveillance? Is it about keeping secrets? Or is it about how you're asked permission to use your data? Because in the end, for the vast majority of what happens to your data, you have consented. So have I. So have most other people in the world. Because if we go back to the idea that if privacy is about control, then consent is your form of control. When was the last time you've read one of these? I'm sure you've seen them. And I'm willing to bet that you haven't read all that many, even if you wanted to. There's an assumption embedded in consent. It is that the user is responsible for personal information management. We're held responsible for revealing information online, for securing passwords, for making decisions about allowing access to data. We are made responsible for that. It is our responsibility, isn't it? Is it not? And the premise is that you have the information to make that decision. It is available to you. It's available to you through terms of service or end-user license agreements or whatever it is that you go through before you reveal data. But users in general, not just smartphone users, but users in general, people who use the internet, people who use these technologies do not typically read end-user license agreements. Now, there's a piece of research that was done about a decade ago where they looked at some of the most famous, some of the biggest websites, and they looked at their terms of service, and they counted how much time it would take to read all of them. They came up with about 300 hours per year. And that was 10 years ago. You can imagine how long it would take if you were to read everything for everything you use, if you were to read not only before you install, but every time they update, because they update terms of service and end-user license agreements as well. Now, if you're a Mac user, you've just installed Sierra, there's an interesting moment that happens, because when you install Sierra, it will ask you that your terms of service or end-user license agreement for, I think, one of the, either the App Store or something like that has changed. And you're supposed to scroll through it and hit I agree at the bottom. If you spent any time actually reading it, your session will time out. Even they don't expect you to read it. Technologically, they've forgotten to give you time to read it. And it wasn't, I guarantee you, it wasn't malicious in any way. They just forgot. They only accounted for scrolling. And most of you never noticed because you scrolled. It's too difficult to understand. There's too much information. There are too few avenues of response. Even if you don't like what you're reading and you're installing OS Sierra on your Mac, what are you going to do? Say no? And then what? So then the question is, okay, is this providing information, these end-user license agreements in terms of service, or is it about shedding responsibility and shifting it all onto users? You guys decide. Is consent the same as control? It's a good question. So who's responsible? Now here's the thing. Most discussions about privacy and data today rely on at least several assumptions. Here's two. That we should like control over data about us, whatever these might be. How do you know which data are yours? It's not an easy question to answer either, but let's skip that for now. The second one is that it is possible to have personal control over data about us. At least if we're not talking about the NSA. Okay, fine, the NSA is doing something illegal. It's very difficult to control there. But at least with all these others, it's possible to control this. And this is a very common controversy. I'm sure you've seen these kinds of statements before, right? People say, our data are being harvested and used by the organizations behind the systems which we rely upon, and largely without our consent. Don't you all get a little bit annoyed? I'm sure. Okay, you've seen these more than once. Yes, okay, we're all tired of it. But really, the expectation is that we're going to be up in arms. And then the response to this is usually this one. You must take the responsibility for your data and prevent this from happening. Now look at the rhetorical trick there. It's an interesting rhetorical trick, where in the first statement you don't have any agency. Your data is taken without your consent. And in the second statement, this is all your responsibility. You must fix this. Really? There's a really interesting notion that is important. It's the idea of informational self-determination. That you must respect the capacity of the individual to determine the disclosure and use of their personal data. That you are responsible individuals that have the capacity to make this determination, and thus the control should be yours. And thus, the end user license agreement, or the terms of service, is a way to empower you to make those decisions. There's a lovely anthropologist in the UK who writes about ethics, and he writes about agency and responsibility. When he says, where persons experience an augmentation to their agency as a form of empowerment, this is not an increase in their general capacity to get what they want done. It comes instead as responsibility for particular happenings, or states of affairs, and these may include states of affairs that they have rather limited capacity to influence. It's not empowerment if the conditions under which you have to function aren't changed. If simply you just have more responsibility and not a whole lot of recourse. It's about power. And it's about the fact that there are institutions in which we believe. And there are institutions in which we have put our trust. And these institutions have turned around and said, well, it's your responsibility for your data. And that's problematic. Of course, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything. Resistance is not futile. And we're going to talk about how to resist and how to protect yourself and how to deal with this, at least in small ways, through technical solutions. It's not the whole answer, but it's an important one, because it's a way to signal that the current state of affairs needs to change, if only that. So really, why should we care? The purpose of these crypto parties and the purpose of trying to motivate students to learn about pretty good privacy and email encryption and the Signal protocol is that we must have options. And you need the ability to protect the content. You need the ability to protect yourself from prying eyes. And you do need to have the option that if you want to protect your souffle recipe, you ought to be able to. This is about recognizing, though, that it's not just you and your personal decision, that there is a complex social world in which we live that demands from us participation in particular ways. And these demands will mean compromising, revealing, and disclosing. And so I would like to say that the care for the data we all generate should not rest entirely on our shoulders. That's the part that's wrong. In part, sure. Entirely, no. But the in part of it, Claudia will talk about it. Thanks.